what we want to do is we want to introduce this group that you're in to the whole world eventually. You know, like people like I'm in the National Arts Club, and the people who are there are more of these New York sophisticates who don't really delve that deeply into the world of the internet, I think, to their disbenefit. But what we really want to do is figure out exactly what you're specifically about, and so people get a better idea of that. Because I still think that there's a divide. People could assume various different things. So we wanted to just ask you a couple of questions to solidify how you see things.
Sure.
Like, I don't think anyone's trying to solidify what you think, because I think a lot of times, one of my favorite quotes, I think it's attributed to Alice in Wonderland, but it might be a misquote, is, how do I know what I think if I haven't even heard what I have to say? And I do remember the last time we were recording, you said something about, like, if you don't have a bunch of contradictions or something, you're subpar or something. And I think we brushed over it. But I think that, you know, like, I'm a fallibilist. Like, I think anything I believe at any point can be wrong. I'm more interested in being right, so I'm not afraid to be wrong. And that inspires me to search for truth. Like, I never find myself comfortable that I've arrived at truth. I'm very interested in searching for truth. And I think that's all related to, you know, like, I'm not about telling people what to think, but I do think it's important to have a culture that teaches people how to think, right? And I think what a lot of the mainstream educational systems, the public schools, the universities, I think they do a lot more to tell people what to think than to teach people how to think. And so I want to ask questions just to get a feel of how you think. I think I know from my own experience that people's positions change and people's positions evolve, and we're constantly acquiring new information and assimilating that, and then, like, moving accordingly. So, like, I'm not trying to pigeonhole you or anyone really, but I do think that you know, it would be cool to ask some questions. I was very interested about that swatting and doxing. So, like, what were people saying? Lev found a Twitter thing that you posted that he thought was covering that controversy. But I wanted to, like, have a fair conversation with our audience, with everyone. Like, what was the controversy, and, like, why is it just totally ridiculous? Because Lev and I are pretty convinced that it was all ridiculous. Like, I've gone through your feeds. Like, I haven't done extreme diligence, but, you know, it just seems like a lot of fair game stuff. I haven't seen anything that's made me go, like, oh, wow, this is radical, like, beyond belief or something. Like, it seems like a combination of literature and, like, politics stuff and some just expressive communication. So yeah, like, how do you see that controversy? Where did it come from? Like, why were people targeting you? That kind of stuff.
I don't know. Like, it didn't really end up amounting to much, and, like, pretty much everyone recognized that it was absurd. So it doesn't, like, it's more, the more point I was trying to get to is that just that, like, this chilling effect, this sort of, like, threat of such things happening is more of a problem than even when they actually do happen. Like, people are very much paranoid about I don't know, like, having, like, people like getting outed to usually, like, their employers or something. Like, a lot of people get fired from people trying, like, there's even a website called, like, gettingracistfired.com or something not too long ago. This sort of where pretty much, like, you know, I don't really know if anyone could be totally immune to such a thing, because anything could really be taken out of context or portrayed in such a way. Like, that's the whole witch hunt kind of culture we're in right now. It happens all the time with people, like, say something or make jokes that were pretty normal or acceptable, like, in the early 2000s even, and get in trouble for them retroactively. It's just, like, a standard practice of the time period, I think. Me personally, I think it's mostly just like guilt by association. Like there are like people who are pretty far into like I guess extremist categories, right? And that kind of exists in the same sphere. Like the whole 4chan thing, like with the New Zealand shooter and stuff like that. Even recently, there are people trying to like ascribe blame to various people for using like the same memes, or like there's like YouTube videos explaining how like PewDiePie is leading kids to becoming terrorists or something.
How would you describe? So, does your circle have a movement, or how do you guys identify? Because Lev said you guys have a circle. It sort of seems like it's amorphous, but like, you look at artists of the past, like you had Warhol's Factory or Gertrude Stein's Salon, or all sorts of literary and artistic movements where people were just inspiring each other. Do you have something that's do you feel like you're in a group that is not so amorphous, that is sort of like a Gertrude Stein Salon or something like that, like the extremely online community or something?
I think it's more like a coalition of the fringes. Like there's been times where things kind of coalesce into specific groups, but those kind of rise up and then disappear. The major one, I think, was Frog Twitter, but Frog Twitter has been less like influential as a total cohesive unit in the last couple of years. Like a lot of the original members left or like went private. Or in like
What's Frog Twitter?
Frog Twitter was like a loose coalition of a bunch of different posters, some of whom are still active, that just kind of was put together. I was just added to it at one point. It was kind of like a little secret cult that was running for a long time.
Who are the members of the Frog Twitter?
There's like an official list. I don't really like want to go into listing everyone off, but like it's changed over time and people have like come and disappeared. But the main product out of that was the LD50 exhibition. We had an art exhibit called Corporeality at LD50, which was that art what is it? What's the word for that? Art space that was protested in England.
Why was it protested?
It was protested because they put on an exhibit where I believe they like interviewed Nick Land and some people from like the, I guess like neo-reactionary zone, and people were like calling these people Nazis.
Well, this is a similar thing that Styx Hexenhammer 666 was accused of when he was speaking to Spencer. But the interesting thing here is that I think that was something that did more good than bad in the long run, because they weren't put into echo chambers. They were actually able to have a discussion where Styx could counter a lot of his stuff. So just in that kind of association, I personally don't see any trouble. But what I think what goes without saying is that you personally, you are not a racist.
Yeah, no, I don't really know what that means. Like, I feel like because like,
well, okay, let's put it this way. You would not elevate white people above any other group of people as far as, limiting freedoms or anything like that. Like, would that be a fair assessment to make?
Yeah, like I'm not like a white nationalist now or anything like that. Like I'm not particularly interested in that. Although like I do have discussions with people who are like you know what I mean? Like I don't think that it's like something that shouldn't ever be discussed. Like I feel like it's a natural argument that comes up and that has to like you have to like discuss or like understand from like their own perspective if you want to have anything to say about it, as opposed to just like I don't know the whole no platforming thing where it's like we'll just put these people into like a ghetto or something. I don't think that's very effective.
No, and that's why I agree with what Styx ended up doing as well there.
Probably makes them fester. But yeah, what are the neo-reaction movements, or what is your analysis of Nick Land? Because I've heard of him, I haven't read him yet. I have his book on my bedside right now, but I'm still wholly ignorant.
He's interesting. I mean, I talk to Nick Land all the time, but that's sort of like how at least I was introduced into this sphere was stumbling upon Mencius Moldbug's writings in a long time ago, like 5, maybe 6 years ago at this point. And that was when I started talking more with like people in that sphere, because it was I don't know, it's just like what some of the more like interesting writing that was happening on the internet. A lot of people I feel like came up in that sphere, and those it's really just a coalition of the fringes is what I'm trying to get across here. Like you have people who are like traditionalist Catholic, like monarchist, ultramontanists, next to like weird post-leftists, and then you have like eco-anarchists and like Kaczynskiites and primitivists, just like pretty much all of the most ridiculous political ideologies.
Like the Nazball people from Alexander Dugin's camp. Yeah, I actually saw a funny video of his where he was talking about how every man should have a beard and how it's considered like, it was in Russian, but it was just really funny the way that he said it. But anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a big deal in the Russian. That was Peter the Great. He made a law against beards. There's a beard tax. It's like a very charged issue.
But as far as a lot of this nobility that some of those Duganites want to bring people back to, like I was talking about earlier.
We're talking about Dugin, but I don't know who Dugin is, and our audience doesn't know who Dugin is. So I just like a very piecemeal, like just establish terms, introduce all these people, like because our audience is not like us.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because a lot of these things are like taken for granted in these circles, like knowing who Dugin and like Nick Land and these various people are, and they're like possibly very like people would put them in the same camp, right? Or like be prone to like calling them Nazis or something.
Why would people put Nick Land and Dugin in the same camp?
Because they don't really like anything that doesn't subscribe to like a standard left-right dichotomy. I feel like in that sort of idea of a third position, everyone immediately puts that into the camp of like Nazism.
I don't think that's true. Fascism. I think because to me, I feel like the third camp is libertarianism. Like I think
you're a libertarian.
Who?
You are, right? So naturally you'd think that. But I'm just saying most people like consider libertarians to just be a type of like conservative.
Now, isn't it correct though to say that Dugin's position, as they're describing it, as a Nazbal Nazi Bolshevism, and at least according to the previous generation of people who lived in the Soviet Union, like my parents' generation, they were looking at somebody like Alexander Dugin as just being a complete fucking dumbass. And a lot of the ideas that he's subscribing, even though it is very romantic to think about, oh, if only we could go back to the good old days. Like I said before, there's a lot of bad shit that happened during those so-called good old days. And I don't necessarily think that anybody should be censored or not spoken with. Couldn't someone
just say that sounds like Make America Great Again? Like, why is he such a... Like, I'm allergic to calling people dumbasses. I think it's harmful to you.
Yeah, okay. So basically Dugin, he actually was a Trump supporter. So he had a bunch of videos like that, and it actually fed a lot of the Trump-Russia speculation sort of things, was because I believe Steve Bannon name-checked him at some point because... I believe he did. So that was a whole snafu. But he's basically like, he's kind of like a troll, really. He's sort of like a Lyndon LaRouche in Russia type person, like a kind of crank fringe figure.
Can we just talk about what Dugin's ideas are?
He's his Eurasianism, like his belief is like in creating a Eurasian empire. So his whole thing is that like Russia as like the third Rome, trying to tie together the geopolitical influences of like China, Turkey, just like the whole Eurasian step into essentially like a super mega USSR, but more modernized with like an Orthodox Christian background. He has a whole idea regarding the historical differences between land and sea power, and that would be like the greatest landmass power. So like that's his whole idea. Like he's like geopolitical type guy.
So it's an alternative. That sounds like an alternative to the EU.
Yeah, sort of, or look like a competitor for global hegemony. Like his whole thing is about multipolarity, so that the United States isn't the sole superpower, but then you would have like a Eurasian superpower.
a Eurasian superpower where, correct me if I'm wrong here, but at least according to what Russia's doing right now, it's pretty much legal to beat your wife up there. It's not a place that I would want to live, nor is it a place that I would want to influence the rest of the Eurasian sphere. And I honestly don't think a lot of people in, let's say, Latvia, for example, or any of those countries, Lithuania, they would not want to be under that sphere by any means. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to be all for the, bring all the economic migrants in mentality of Angela Merkel in that EU sphere either. But again, it's like if we're choosing something horrible and something bad, I'd rather go for something bad in the meantime. So that's why, even though this is kind of like you say, a third position, that sure, it should absolutely be part of the discussion. It shouldn't be censored. But at the same time, I think all the more reason why it should be called out on its, as the trendy millennials like to say today, problematicness of it.
Yeah, I'm not that interested in doing that either, because I don't know. I don't feel like the moral point of view is that useful when like having a discussion about these sort of theoretical things, because there's literally no system that is morally pure. So you just end up in like a whataboutist argument back and forth, like when you're like discussing communism with someone and they talk about the death toll of capitalism, and then you say the death toll of communism, and you go back and forth. Like, I don't really think those discussions really go anywhere when you're just trying to talk about the problematic nature or whatever, like the contradictions in someone else's discourse.
The only area that I think it does go into, which is beneficial, is that of, like Jules and I like to say, government supremacy, where you basically have people exerting a large influence over the rest of the populace, where a lot of them are disarmed, they can't defend against their tyrannical government, they end up being sent to various camps. Like, that's not a reality that I'm in favor of, and I don't think you're in favor of that reality either, are you?
I mean, no, but there are people who are. Like, I'm more like not in favor of that in regards to my own circumstances, but China's doing that right now, and I don't feel particularly moved to try to do anything about it, right? Like, I'm not interested in like having regime change to make sure that the Chinese don't do that. You know what I mean? Like, that's not my problem.
Well, I wanted to mention one thing when we're talking about these third positions. It doesn't sound like Dugan can fit into a third position for the primary reason that he's not an American. Like, he's not talking about American politics, right? As in, I feel like a lot of people create these false dichotomies, and it's a way of like kind of controlling a conversation. But I think that, sure, we can compare anything to anything, but I think that when it comes to like Dugan's politics, like none of them apply to America except understanding other people's positions to understand your own. As in, we don't exist in a vacuum, so that's why Dugan's politics are worth learning about. But as far as like putting him in this total umbrella of a third option, I think it's disingenuous.
I just mean that when I said that, I meant more like in America, where we have basically two positions, or this idea where there's like two sides to an issue, right? So there's like the left and there's the right, and there's the Republicans and there's the Democrats, and there's the liberals and there's the conservatives. And pretty much anything that doesn't fit into that general narrative is suspect. Like, you'll have, I don't know, like, and this sort of painting goes on both sides too. You'll have like Republicans or libertarians talking about how the opposite side are like statists, and therefore they're closer to being like communists and Nazis. So they're Joseph Stalin, and they're also Hitler. But then you also have people doing the opposite, where they'll say like that the people that are conservatives are the ones who are actually like closer to being the communists and the fascists or whatever. I just don't like. That's more what I was getting at, in that anything that doesn't seem to fit into this like binary discourse gets kind of put together as like the boogeyman of like the outside, which happens to generally take the position of the 20th century boogeyman.
So you said you talked to Nick Land a lot. You said that?
Yeah, we have similar interests in certain things, like the history of Protestantism and stuff. So I interact with him on Twitter a lot.
I didn't know he was on. What's his Twitter handle?
Outsideness.
Outsideness. So he's an accelerationist, and you said you're a de-accelerationist.
I don't think he would call himself. I don't know if he would call himself an accelerationist, but probably. I feel like he wouldn't be averse to that.
Well,
But
you know, Kantbot, you're friends with Kantbot because you were in that viral video with him.
Yeah. I'm friends with Kantbot.
So when he says that Nick Land is responsible for the Christchurch shooting, or if he I think on Autistic Mercury, there's an article that blames accelerationists for the Christchurch shooting. How would you translate that to us?
I don't know. I haven't read the article, but I think that was mostly because I don't know. I feel like that could be a troll. Like if Kantbot said that, I would mostly expect that to be a joke. I didn't read the article. I don't know who wrote it, so I can't really comment on it. I could say that there's an argument to be made, or people have made the argument that the accelerationists and the manifesto of this shooter was very explicitly trying to ratchet up the racial tensions in America to possibly foment a global race war of some sort. So I guess you could say that, although I don't really think that's not really Nick Land's wheelhouse. He's more interested in having, I don't know, a break. I guess he does want a balkanization of these sort of power structures, and I guess you could fill in the blanks there and say that you would need some sort of civil war for that to happen.
What's a balkanization?
Like in the Balkans in the 90s when the Soviet Union broke up and there were all those civil wars over smaller states. So it's like a large state turning into a bunch of smaller states. Like people having the idea of the U.S. being balkanized, so it wouldn't be the United States of America as one country, but maybe there'd be several different entities.
So a balkanization would be a breakdown in federalism and be more state rights.
Well, it would be a dissolution of the Union in its entirety. So it's the idea that if the EU disappeared and then within all of those states also you had independence movements. So Scotland became its own country and Catalonia became its own country, and all of these sort of separatist movements were to be successful. That would be essentially a balkanization.
Interesting. I don't think that would happen here. I think our Constitution is really strong. I don't think that without passing an amendment, I don't think that there could be a balkanization over here. So you're saying that that's what Nick Land supports? He wants a balkanization in America, or where?
Well, just kind of his is I don't really want to speak on his behalf here because I don't really know what his opinions on
we're allowed to be mistaken
specifically, but more he's interested in there being more competition in the sovereignty business, the general neo-reactionary viewpoint on governments is that they're sovereign corporations, so that and the goal is to have the freedom of exit. So the idea that there should be more competition in regards to stateship, so there'd be more smaller countries, more experimentation in how they'd be governed, and more movement of peoples between those things. A sort of voting with your feet as opposed to by the ballot.
That sounds like not a bad idea when you put it that way.
Well, honestly, it kind of grows. You'd probably be interested in reading a lot of the neo-reactionary stuff because it comes out of the libertarian schools. It's mostly people who are Hoppians or general, coming out of Rothbard and all that school of Austrian economics. It's but skeptical of democracy. So they're kind of more open to the idea of monarchy or basically corporate monarchy or joint stock republics and things like that.
What would you say would be the biggest risk, or even better, what would you say if there was somebody who was your enemy, somebody who would want to dox you, let's say, and they would try to form some kind of an argument against what you're saying, what do you think it would necessarily be?
I mean, I think it's just the easiest stuff. Generally, I'm pretty, I'm a nice guy. I'm a good boy. I don't do anything wrong really, but it doesn't really matter. I'm a bit skeptical of, I guess the whole transgender wave and a lot of other things like that. I'm a bit skeptical. I'm generally subscribed personally to a more traditional Christian sort of morality. I don't necessarily think of progress as being necessarily like a moral improvement all of the time. So it just general stuff like that. I believe that there's differences amongst races, not like in a sense where it's like less than human or anything like that, but I just think that it's like scientifically demonstrable in the age of like haplogroups and whatnot, then like these things should be able to be openly discussed. So I don't know, pretty much anything where there's a nuanced take could just be portrayed as not being a nuanced take and just being a flat like blank phobia, which is generally the strategy people go for.
I noticed Kantbot was making a joke a while ago. He wants the permanent N-word pass, which I thought is pretty funny. I saw Tim Allen from Home Improvement was demanding to be able to use the N-word. And then there was a funny Trevor Noah skit where they were speculating about, they say Trump is on a recording saying the N-word from when he was on The Apprentice or something. And then I heard of speculation that the reason why they haven't leaked it is because they don't want to disarm the word. Like they're afraid that they would release it to try to character assassinate Trump, and that suddenly the taboo would disappear. Like suddenly it would just be like everyone's allowed to say it. Like it's no longer a store for hate, and now it's just a big silly farce, and people have been emotionally exfoliated, and we can like move on to stressing about more productive things. But I have no desire to say the N-word. Like I've said it, but like it's I think that you got to be sensitive, and it is fun to make people uncomfortable and to push buttons. Like South Park says it brilliantly. Like sometimes things are so not funny that they're funny. And like I have friends on Instagram that kind of have pointed out the absurdity of what you are and aren't allowed to say. So I could see people trying to cherry pick on some social media activity to like make a statement that no one is making, but in a way it would kind of show what do you think? Like for people to just create a simplified narrative of you as a boogeyman, I feel like they're gonna say you hate women, you're racist, you're white nationalist or something, and it's like, you're 24 years old, you're extremely online, you're extremely well read, listening to talk about the things you're talking about, you're obviously very sophisticated. I'm curious, what are joint stock republics? You mentioned what's a joint stock republic?
Well, it's interesting. Like, so the idea in like the neo-reactionary literature, this was like what Moldbug called formalism, would be the idea that you'd have. It's basically a way of recapitulating the older style of republics. So not everyone has voting rights. You have voting rights in accord to how much like property you own, essentially, inside this republic. So it's like proportional representation amongst that, but like people can live inside it still, I believe. So the idea is that like the government structure is governed like a corporation. So there'd be like, a board of stock owners in the culture, and then people would vote amongst the stockholders for like the CEO, things like that. It's essentially just a way of like turning a government into like a private business or like a real estate enterprise almost.
So if you want to vote, you have to pay taxes, and if you don't want to pay taxes, then you can't vote. Something like that, or?
Well, I mean, it's not really like specifically laid out. Like it's more. Well, I guess he did. If you really are interested, you should read Moldbug's Formalist Manifesto. He has different ideas on it than like the way that I would want to implement such a structure. Like I had an idea that I was calling hyper republicanism a while ago, but it was mostly just a way of like changing the structure of elections. But I don't know. I feel like.
Why do you think Peter Thiel backs Mencius Moldbug?
Because he's interesting. If you read up on Urbit is a pretty interesting idea in regards to data security in the like upcoming future. Urbit is a very interesting project. It's a way of making everyone an owner of their own data, as opposed to just giving away for free, essentially.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I just want to avoid any things having to do with destroying human rights. Like, a lot of the complaints that we may have about the social justice warriors or this overemphasis on political correctness, the correction that I see there is, number one, through being able to talk about it, through not being censored, through humor, through ridicule, whatever you want to call it. Like, however you want to react to that, feel free to react to that. But on the other hand, I don't think that having a position of, and you don't have this position, and I know you don't have this position from the conversation that we've had, but some people would, let's say, be in favor of something like Sharia law. And there was even a meme going around, I remember back in 4chan, about white Sharia, where there needs to be this control set over the family unit, over women, in order for society to function at a certain level. And I don't think there's any going back as far as I actually value the freedom that we have to screw up, for people to make bad decisions. And I think that we, as this egotistical group of people, are going to learn from whatever mistakes we make in the end. And I don't think forcing things to be in a particular mold now is going to make any difference. I think that's only going to create a reaction from the reaction.
Well, the whole idea of critiquing the human rights ideology is just basically, like, I think it's part and parcel with people having skepticism regarding liberalism in general, because like, human rights are only existent in a liberal order. So if you have people who are questioning,
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. It depends on how you define it.
I mean, the historical construct of the idea of human rights only exists in the liberal context. Like, there was no conception of human rights as such prior to.
Yeah, but altruism exists in the animal
That's not what I'm talking
kingdom.
about. I'm talking about the explicit legal concept of human rights.
I think that a big mistake is to rely more and more on government law over, like, natural or common law. As in,
see, that's
like,
you're using. This is what I'm saying. You are actually using, like, liberal presuppositions here. Like, this is like in the preamble to the Constitution, right? Like, you're talking about natural rights, talking about rights granted by God, etc. These things are questionable. People do question them. This is like a part of the liberal worldview.
It's okay for people to question them, but at the end of the day, if, let's say, those are not forged in any document, if we're not relying on any legalese for it, what I don't want to have happen is I don't want people to needlessly suffer, or I don't want there to be a closed door to people who, let's say, they were born in some position that other people may not find that high, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
where do you think human rights come from? Like, you personally, like, where do you?
I think that they were, like, produced as an idea during, like, the early modern period.
Who gives you your human rights?
See, like, you're asking, like, I don't really have, like, a particular perspective on this. I'm more of, like, a materialist, I guess, in this regard. Like, I'm more interested, like, for instance, we have the right to free speech and the right to bear arms, etc.
Mhm.
Right? But these things aren't absolute in their own context, right? Like, you have the right to free speech. You can scream into your pillow, you know, you can say whatever you want, you can publish these things, but it's also abridged at certain points, which is true pretty much everywhere. So the question in my mind is, I'm more of, like, a Stirnerist, like, try to look at these things without the spooks of, like, ideology. So the question to me is, like, what are your, like, technological capabilities to secure your rights for yourself? I don't really trust in anything other than your own, like, force, or, like, the force of a collaboration of individuals to secure your own rights over something, right? Like, yeah.
That's why we've got that's why we've got the Second Amendment, right? Like, that is something that differentiates us from Europe, where I think it's way more likely that there's going to be a civil war.
Yeah, I mean, the question of, like, whether there'd be a civil war in America, like, I don't think so. I do think that the two tribes in America, as people have been saying it, like, the various Americas, have been splitting apart pretty violently, like, at least intellectually violently. Like, there's not a lot of discussion between them, and I think that the polarization is increasing, which is what happened last time there was a civil war, when there was no longer a discussion to be had. Eventually, it had to come fisticuffs. So I don't think that it would happen in the same way just because of the way warfare has changed, but I could see like some sort of immense crackdown on one side of the spectrum. Generally, I think that the Democratic side would win, considering that they have all of the hard power. Well, it depends. If the military were to like split off or something, you could have a very dangerous circumstance.
I see you as someone that's starved for conversation. I see you as someone that values elevated discussion. And I don't know what your views are on democracy, but to me, it seems like you participate in it more than the average citizen. And you use terms with a familiarity that is not common these days. So, I find you to be very fascinating as someone who, you've said on Twitter that you don't vote and you're going to vote for the first time for Andrew Yang.
Hell
and,
yeah.
and you have all these political views. And I think that people would benefit from nuanced conversations. And I like this phrase. I keep hearing sunlight is the best disinfectant. The human rights issue, you said something about the human rights issue, and I felt like there was a connotation that I was missing, like rights issue.
Well, so for instance, right, it kind of gets complicated, right? So if you believe in human rights, right, do you believe that we have a moral duty to ensure that everyone has their human rights, like including outside of your national territories? Like, because I see this sort of rhetoric as being used
I know everything can be complicated, and not everything is articulated or back to Alice in Wonderland. How do I know what I think if I haven't heard what I have to say?
Yeah.
So I know, like myself, like when I talk to Lev sometimes, I'll start experimenting with ideas and I'll say, like, I haven't thought this one through yet. Like a lot of the stuff I talk about, I have my own blog, Polyglamorous, and I'm very open with everyone in my life. And some of my ideas I would mull over for like a year or years before I felt confident and strong enough to be able to speak my mind. That's because I did the back end work. Like I would write out my ideas, I would look at them, I would share them, I would sort of see how people reacted, and I would attract criticism, and I would try to find my own errors, my own blind spots, and self-correct, and yada yada. But when it comes to the human rights thing, I know it can be complicated. But so you don't have to tell me your position, but so break it down for us. What are the different things that make the human rights issue complicated? Because to me, the human rights issue, it sounds vague. Like most people won't know what we're talking about right now, because I don't yet.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's like a particular thing, like as if people are discussing the human rights question, although some people are. There's just various schools of thought to it, right? Generally, the notion of human rights comes out of Protestant, generally Anglo discourses of like common law, where they're like from the history of England, really, where you have the Magna Carta and whatnot, these sorts of things. Whereas like there was a much slower growth of the notion of human rights in other contexts. Like human rights was considered like anathema in Orthodox and Catholic discourses for the most part, because they have a different form of theology in regards to like what your rights are, what you're owed by the government, et cetera, et cetera. But the real issue is the one that I'm interested in, and the one that I find most problematic, I guess, is if you believe that human rights are like a human universal and that they need to be enforced everywhere, then you sort of ultimately lead to an almost Trotskyist notion of the global revolution, because there's a lot of areas that don't have human rights or don't quote unquote.
I don't think so. I don't think so. And
I don't think so either.
And so I'm starting here, right? I'm speaking from an American perspective, right? And so I think that when it comes to human rights, right, it's sort of like, what's in your best interest, right? Is it in your best interest for government to give you your human rights, or is it best in your best interest for your human rights to come from your creator? And I think when you start playing lawyer games, like one is on your side and one isn't.
The other argument isn't that they come from like I don't really know what you're trying to get at here, but like okay,
I'm
for
saying
instance,
there's two options. Your human
I
rights
don't think those are the
from a
only two
legal
options.
perspective. As a lawyer, that's gonna like I'm gonna serve you with papers. Let's say I have a lot of money and I'm a fucking psycho, and I'm like I'm just gonna sue you to fucking drive you to suicide. Not because I have any gripe, not because I have money to earn, but because like I can literally use the force of the law to just crush you, right? I can drag you through court and I can bankrupt you and I can destroy your life on a whim. So when you're in a world where the legal system is the institutionalization of how people cooperate, right? So if what makes people exceptional is our ability to create tools and our ability to cooperate, engineering is the institutionalization of tool making, and the legal system is the institutionalization of cooperation. So when we're thinking about the institutionalization of cooperation, where do you think your rights come from? And if you think they come from the laws, I think you're gonna have a very bad time if you're on the bottom.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is what I'm saying where like if I'm saying I'm skeptical of the ideology of human rights is that they're never absolute and they're always circumstantial even when they're described as being absolute. So it's more like they are given to you by the laws because all of your human rights can be stripped of you if you were to break XYZ law. Like you could be arrested, you could be
I don't think they come
framed.
from, yeah, but I don't think they come from the law. I think that this is what politicians and social engineers have been trying to establish, kind of like saying capitalism is the problem instead of this Fabian socialism or corporatism. I think that people, it's sort of like when it's like people are looking at the system that's baked in and they're saying, oh, because this is the way it is, there's no way to go back. And I think that it's not true. I think that if you're someone that thinks nothing matters and you're insignificant and you're meaningless and your actions don't have ripples, I think it'll make you a lot more cynical to reality than is warranted.
What I'm saying more is that like let's just take the free speech, right? You have the right to free speech, but you even have it if you're arrested and you're in jail. You can still speak. Like, what is the different? What like where the question is always like, what does that mean?
The difference is if they want to do a clampdown. The difference is if they want to slowly, like you were talking about how you mentioned that you thought the Christchurch shooter or accelerationists like want to ratchet things up, right? They want to accelerate things. Well, you want to make sure you're accelerating in the right direction, right? You're a de-accelerationist. You said that. I don't know what that is. But if you want to de-accelerate certain things, one thing you should want to de-accelerate is government clampdown.
Well, what about corporate clampdowns?
Yeah, but corporations are just extensions of the government. Like when the government is passing laws in the favor of corporations, you don't clamp down on them by regulating them. You actually take away the rules that they use to leverage against other people.
I don't know about that. I feel like if we made it so that there was, if like, for instance, if you were to regulate.
I do know about that.
Well, if you were to regulate, say, do you believe that like common carrier legislation is good? Like the idea that, you know, you can't be taken, like, do you think that ISPs and like companies like PayPal and stuff should be able to deny people service based off of like, I don't know, some sort of accusation against their character? Because like I know people personally who are unable to use a lot of different services because they've been banned for being essentially brigaded by people for having ostensibly done something wrong in the past. Like,
so I don't think that should be happening, but I also don't think it should be like illegal. As in, I think that all the laws in place, I think all the laws in place make it harder.
Well, what I'm saying is if you don't think that like, if you don't think that YouTube, Twitter, these sorts of things, Google, Facebook, etc., if they don't have to be legislated like common carriers, then you do believe that they should be able to like, you know, deplatform people based off of basically anything that they want to do.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, well then you don't have free speach on the internet.
I do.
Like, do you think that your ISP, like say you live in a town and you only have one like potential internet service provider except they don't want to do business with you. Do you think that they should be allowed to like not give you internet?
The problem is the legalistic glut. So Twitter's a private company.
It's also
They
a common
can-
carrier, though.
I'm not sure
Like-
about that, but let's say it is. I am against regulating them. I think monopolies are apocryphal. I think the only true monopoly is government, and even governments have to compete with other governments and their own citizens. And I think that when laws make things more expensive and harder to do, it consolidates power. So when I read your feed, I read the feed of someone who resents the consolidation of power. And if you think the solution is to play into their hands and do what we've always done and like pass more laws, it's just more of the same. It's just more unintended consequences. It's more raising of prices. It's higher barriers to entry. It's
Okay, so you support that Alex Jones was able to be deplatformed from all of the major internet carriers?
I do, and I think people
All right, well, I
are
disagree
better
with
at,
you.
and I think people are better at codifying behavior than the government. As in, I think the reason why Amazon raised its prices for its workers is not because they passed a law. It's because Bernie Sanders made everybody raise their eyebrows. I think
didn't
if a
actually
bunch of
raise the
people,
wages.
I think if a bunch of people, the reason why I think if a bunch of people really dislike something you're doing, they are much more powerful codifiers of behavior than the law. Like the reason why you're anonymous is not because it's a legal requirement. It's because you're afraid of strangers.
So, Jules,
Yeah.
if let's say the internet companies were regulated like Logo's talking about, what do you see as being the bad consequences of that?
If they were treated like phone companies, right? Like telephone corporate companies aren't allowed to deny people service based off of, I don't know, their ideology. Like you don't get your phone service taken away if you're calling people and talking about the wrong things, but you can do that if you're making YouTube videos.
Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like it either. And that's why I'm friends with a lot of people who are really pro regulating all this stuff. I'm just saying that I think it's penny wise, pound foolish. As in, I think it's like you call one person an idiot, they call you an idiot. You regulate this thing, they regulate that thing. You regulate this thing, you regulate that thing. And it's just more consolidation of power.
These sites, they also seem to be looking at the European model, for instance, as a possible globalist universal model as opposed to the American one when it comes to what exactly counts as free speech. Because in Europe, it's way tougher. People get arrested for posting things against the migrants. And that's, I'm sure...
We're going to go in that direction if we pass more laws. I think that's inevitable. If we start passing more laws as answers to these things, it's just going to be more censorship.
So,
I disagree. I think that you have to pass laws that make it so that you can't pass laws in order to do that. So you'd have to make them like
Bingo.
barriers.
Bingo. Bingo. Bingo.
Yeah.
And the only way to
that's
do
what the
that is an
common carrier
amendment.
legislation is.
The only way to do that is an amendment. You need
Okay, yeah. I'm all down for an amendment.
2/3. You need 2/3 vote, right? So it has to benefit the weakest. It has to benefit the small states. Like when people try to say, oh, we should get rid of the electoral college, never going to happen because the small states are never going to vote for an amendment that gets rid of their power. But people will vote for an amendment that gives everybody more power, right? That's in citizens' best interests. So I think
That's why
we do.
the UBI is going to win.
I think it will eventually. I hope so.
So I'm glad we're starting to agree on certain things here. I think these are the conversations that need to happen way more often than they do. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, I just like, I don't really have like a specific ideology. Like I'm just trying to look at the various different ones and kind of how they interlock into each other, because I'm more interested in like meta politics, I guess, because like I can understand, like I can tell that you're very much in like the libertarian tradition just by the way that you're discussing these issues. I'm pretty well read in a lot of the libertarian stuff, but I don't think that it's like libertarians have a hard time grasping oppositions to the libertarian fundamental axioms.
I know, well, for me, it's not so much about not considering that there could be other ways of going about government. For me, it's personally about like what Thomas Sowell likes to talk about, the unintended consequences. So Just like, for example, when Ocasio-Cortez talked about taxing people 70% who are in the 1%. Well, that's not just going to stay there. That's going to go down every single fucking tax bracket in order to pay for the things that she wants to be paid for. So I want to take a look at what exactly are the repercussions of any single thing, even something that on the surface I could agree that, sure, like if these tech companies were regulated, maybe there's going to be less censorship. But what then? Because I think what Jules is talking about is there may be an unintended consequence that neither I nor you are aware of at this time that's going to result from that.
Well, absolutely, but that's true of any action. You kind of have to take that for granted if you're going to make any action. No one can see the effects of everything.
I don't like that Alex Jones was kicked off, but I also think that the people that are trying to censor him, I think it's going to backfire. I don't
think it has.
I think it is backfiring. I think that it's just maybe not happening as cathartically or as quickly as you would like. But I think that it's a genuine anti-fragile phenomenon that we're witnessing in culture and public discourse, where the Streisand effect is real, that the things that they don't want you to focus on, like people's survival instincts, like their spider senses start tingling and they're like, okay, let's pay attention to what they're telling us to not pay attention to.
Yeah, I do think that this sort of thing, like, it will lead to the sort of legislation I'm talking about, like treating a lot of the things on the internet as if they're common carriers. And like Alex Jones will be a part of that. But in the meantime, his livelihood has been very much impacted. Like his ability to enter into the public discourse has been very much impacted by being taken off of these platforms, which, for example, someone like Richard Spencer is not. So it's not like it's even a very coherent like enforcement of these rules in the first place. It's like almost entirely arbitrary, which is why it's particularly like tyrannical, in my opinion. I'd rather have a tyrant where I could predict their actions.
Yeah, you want to something consistent. No one wants a tyrant. No one wants a tyrant, but there does seem to be an inconsistency.
I don't know. I feel like that. Like this is the other thing. Like I'm not like totally avert. Like I don't think that representative democracy is like the only satisfying or good way to run something. Like if you had a like autocrat who was also just like really good and like totally benevolent and didn't like do anything wrong. Like if you look at like Liechtenstein or some other.
That doesn't last a lot of generations though. Like I remember the Venetians wanted to do that, so they got their dictator. The first one was good, the second one was okay, but I think the third one sucked. So
I mean, that's the origin of political philosophy though, is the idea that all of these state forms, no matter which one, whether or not, like you could say like, well, has our democracy not devolved in a certain way into like an oligarchy? Like
yes,
like you know what I mean?
It has.
It's not like any of these.
It has.
Are impervious.
Well, I'd be interested if we had those floating cities, the ones that like Peter Thiel is trying to develop. Like if you wanted to try benevolent dictatorships, like people build an island off of Dubai or off of Silicon Valley or something, and then they have sovereignty in their little nexus, and then you can volunteer in and you can leave if you want, allowing people sea-setting. Yeah, like if people want to have a benevolent dictator on a sea-setting island, that sounds like a reasonable experiment if we're trying to create bodies to experiment with different political organizations. But when it comes to America, I think that is not what we want.
I agree that it's not feasible in America. I'm just saying that I don't take like a universalist perspective where I think that the United States government is like the God-given and the ultimate form of government, and that everyone should aspire to have it. You know what I mean? Like I'm not interested in exporting it or telling other people how they ought to organize their countries.
Well, at the moment, if I were somebody who was at least like the friends of mine who are living in Latvia, for instance, I would be looking towards the American government or even the EU government much more favorably than I would be looking at Putin's Russia right now. So there are still different choices that we have to make. They're not great choices. I wish it could be better. I wish we could all be, in a way, connected with Mother Gaia or whatever you want to call it, but we're not there right now. So picking what we have right now, I just don't want whatever choices we make to result in a worse outcome. That's all. That's my position.
Yeah, I mean that's I feel like that's most people's positions. The question is always about means. So yeah, any other questions?
I don't know. Like I think we got a lot of stuff here, and thank you. I mean, Jules, do you have anything else?
No, I could talk.
time.
I could talk about this stuff. I could talk about this
Yeah.
stuff forever. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think human rights, very important. Government supremacy is a reality. I do not want a dystopia, and I'm an optimist. So I think it's really important to be pragmatic and to not shoot yourself in the foot thinking that you're going after people who you blame for injustice in the system and just play into their hands.
Yeah. Okay. So I got one last question on the human rights thing, right? So we could agree that that other countries do not have the same human rights or the same definition or legal structure of human rights that we have in the United States, correct?
Sure.
Okay. Should they?
I think that when it comes to this, it's sort of like you asking me if you should. Like, should you lose your virginity when you're 14? Should you lose it when you're 25? Should you lose it when you're 30 or never? I'm saying
that to say that you think that it's like.
I think you can derive
progress?
shoulds. I think so if we're going to talk about David Hume's is-ought fallacy, like I actually think you can derive shoulds from ises, but I don't think this is one of them. Okay. Yeah, I just see like I don't know. I grew up. You laughed. That makes me excited. You laugh because you don't think you can derive shoulds from ises?
Oh no.
You don't? Oh,
No,
absolutely you can.
I think that
Absolutely you can.
I think that normative judgments and like the ought is entirely based in the imagination and projected onto the world. And it can correspond more or less with certain patterns in it, but it's fundamentally based off of in my opinion, a like theological view. Like it comes.
That was incoherent to me. But I like that you laughed.
Well. I just think it's interesting because like your whole thing is your conception here is based off of Christian natural law, right? This idea.
No.
It absolutely is historically.
Like doesn't matter what it is historically. There's a poverty to historicism. It doesn't matter. No, it doesn't. Matters. Actually, it doesn't.
It matters a lot. No, but
it only does to the people that play in the narrative creation. But history is a very bad tool for creating and predicting the future. And in fact, if history is your only model for determining things, then you're gonna have a really bad time.
Oh, sure. No, not the only model. No.
I think that the poverty to historicism here is when you rely on historical arguments to make your case, when really you can do without them completely.
I don't know. Man. I don't know a time where people weren't in a historical circumstance or determined to a certain degree by their superstructure of not only the economy, but mostly like the technology.
When we're talking about is-ought, right? It's sort of like you go to, it's good. You kind of go to like a historical epistemology.
Well, you go to the Ten Commandments, right? Like
I don't. I'm an atheist.
Well, you might think that, but I think you're quite a Christian in a lot of sense. You're mostly a Protestant, really. These are like Protestant understandings. Like seriously, no, I'm not kidding. Like you're essentially like a Unitarian.
I think
like your arguments have been made for centuries. They came from somewhere.
Well, the is-ought
intellectual tradition came from somewhere.
Right, but the refutation of the is-ought fallacy has not been around for hundreds of years, right? Because David Hume, when was that, 1780?
That's hundreds of years.
It is hundreds of years, isn't it? But it doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same way. When I think of hundreds of years, it's sort of like America just makes it, right?
It's about the same time as America. Interesting, right? Like this is like our foundational ideas, right?
Yes.
Founded by like Enlightenment Protestant thinking after generally in a sort of Calvinist vein or a post-Calvinist vein, usually by Unitarians, right? And a lot of them deists, So these things have like a history.
But look where Calvinism itself came from. John Calvin was, correct me if I'm wrong here, but he was ruling a theocracy in Switzerland where he forbid dancing and singing, and he did allow people to drink in the bar, but only if they were listening to a religious sermon. So that is not what the founding fathers were about. So again, these things, I don't really care that
what
much.
Their grandparents were about.
Sure, but that's not what was on the minds of the founding fathers. They didn't give a shit about whether people danced or not. So I can take the full package of whatever it was that Calvin was about and transfuse it into the culture that we currently have here.
It changed absolutely. But if you want to look, like, there's a lot of writing about like the development of capitalism and Protestantism. So, for instance, a lot of the notion, right, that you are like, if you work hard, like, this like work hard and you're like rewarded by God, this sort of salvation by works, etc. This sort of element of Protestantism, or some sects of Protestantism, it's very much at the root of the sort of American industry early on. Right?
Sure, I could see that, but the question then is, where do we go from here? So you were talking before about these foreign governments. Let's say we have some government in the Middle East with a tyrannical dictator, like a hard-fisted dictator, right? And we're asking,
like Saddam Hussein.
like Saddam Hussein. So as far as
invade?
No, we should not. But then there's this other question: what exactly qualifies people to receive the light of Republican democracy, let's say, or republic, or whatever you want to call it? I think it should be whether people could handle, let's say, somebody investing in their territory and being able to do business there without that much corruption, which is why I don't have that much faith in Russia as it is at the moment, because people's businesses always get taken over by Putin's cronies. So people don't want to do business in a shithole like that, pardon my French. And that should be the measure of whether a country and its people are ready for us to spread our ideas further there, even though I still think we should exist as a guiding light to other people who, by their own efforts, are going to do it. Yeah?
I don't buy into this, like, sort of, this is like something that I'm very much against, right?
All right.
Like, this sort of, like, it's basically like imperialist paternalism, right? This idea that, like, we're the
That's what it sounded like.
I'm almost a sort of like isolationist, like, I think that, like, the United States should step down from being the global police force or considering itself the model to which everything needs to compare itself. Like, which is part of my aversion to that sort of discourse. Like, Russia has its own path, like, they can do their own thing.
George Washington was an isolationist. Libertarians tend to be very isolationist. I differ with a lot of libertarians on their brand of isolationism, because I think, again, isolationism as an ideal is really good, but pragmatically might not be so good at the current moment. Just like I'm in theory an open borders person, but I think you need to piecemeal your way there. Like, you got to know the weather outside. If there's a hurricane coming, you get the hurricane reports and you board your windows and you board your door. It doesn't mean you want your windows and door boarded all the time. It just means you need to know what the heck is going on outside, right?
Well,
and so
you're a contextualist, basically.
Yeah, sure.
That makes sense.
Before we were talking about morality, right? And I am not in favor of legislating morality, even though I want to emphasize certain positive things about life that certain people who may end up really lonely are missing out on, as far as starting a family, the benefit of motherhood, things like that. I would never legislate it, though. And same thing with these other countries. I would not want America to legislate or force any country to do something that it does not want to do. But at the same time, just being a good example, I see nothing wrong with that whatsoever.
I just meant more like my point was ultimately that this sort of human rights rhetoric was used, at least earlier on in my life, like a very formative time, to lead us into expansionist, like, imperial wars, which I was very much against.
I know that sucks. I hate it. I hate it.
Like Syria, it happens all the time. People are like,
sure. No, dude,
I think if anything, you got to influence them with soft power. Like, we influence the world through Hollywood, through the internet, the way that we'll drop USBs in North Korea. Like, I'm much more in favor of that behavior than physically interventionist, like troops on the ground, like, let's take your oil, like that kind of stuff.
I'm
right?
more of
And
like a Swiss like I just want to like, like don't bother, like just leave everyone alone,
yeah, yeah,
We're
exactly.
not living in a vacuum, and that's the thing that sucks. If we were living in the vacuum, we could be like Switzerland. Switzerland's got tons of weaponry in the mountains, like it's ready for action in case anything goes down as far as people invading it. But generally speaking, we're not living in a vacuum, and that's that is what it is. There's always going to have to be some kind of a balance of power going on here. Like Europe,
Yeah, like if someone has a grudge against you and you don't even know it, it doesn't really do you a lot of good if you're like not anticipating like angry people. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like if there's people in the world that see Erica as a big enemy, like I don't think like prostrating ourselves would take their grudge away. I think only elevating their happiness and like totally disarming and dissolving the conflict could create that kind of harmony and hegemony and peace.
You know how you're saying like how like you do things and then it can cause like the opposite effect, right? Like you call someone an asshole, they call you an asshole back, etc. I mostly see that sort of like our types of meddling in various areas are the things that come back to bite us in the ass. Like in Afghanistan, etc. We were the ones who trained all of these people
Yes.
to fight the Soviets and whatnot. So I honestly think that had we done nothing, things would be much better off,
Yes.
So I'm more of like a Zen like person, I guess. Like I think most of the time things should just be left to create their own spontaneous order.
It does seem they've been cultivated, like the government cultivated them by arming them and it seems like stirring them up somehow.
Yeah, like that's just my general thing. I think that it's like a pretty sad historical fate for the United States to have huge military empire. I don't think that it's like very good for us as citizens. I don't think it benefits us. I think it's like to our detriment for the most part. It's kind of parasitic on our own well-being, at least in the 20th century.
At the same time,
So-
Europe hasn't been in a war since World War II. And
yeah, but I don't care. Fuck Europe. I don't give a shit.
things
that go on next door can creep into your home, right? Like you can be isolationist to a fault, as in
I don't know. If I was around during World War II, I probably would have been a pacifist. Like I would have been against the United States entering into the war. Like I'm against the United States entering into pretty much any war.
You have the point of view, if I'm not mistaken, that if we take a country like Africa and say, oh, Africa, all these poor people are starving there, they're dying, why don't we take like 75% of our wealth and spread it across there? The reason why I'm not for that is that that's going to disengage whatever enterprising things America is doing, and everything's going to fall down. Because I don't want everything to fall down, there has to be places like the United States where innovation is happening. And while that innovation is happening, I would want that innovation to spread to other places, not forcefully, but still that way. I want all the ships to be lifted, including Africa, including Europe, which is currently in this shitty state, including every other place, but without ruining everything in the process of trying to elevate the entire world up.
Yeah, we're like the world's government. We really are like the world's police. Like we are the primary force of the UN. Like we back up most of the world, and I do think that there is a problem there, and I do think that we really need to peel back and become more isolationist. But I think that we can't ignore our partnerships and cooperation and how these things are symbiotic a lot of the time. Like you are not purely human DNA. Like you have a lot of organisms in your digestive tract that have different DNA from you. And if they weren't in your body, you would be dead.
Yeah, I just mean more that the American hegemony over the globe is just a remnant of the Cold War, but the Cold War has been over for a while. And so now there's kind of there's sort of a debate on whether or not we enter into another Cold War with like China. And there would basically be, this is why Dugin's interesting, right? Because you can imagine if the world were to split along two lines, right, into like another, if you were to imagine like a World War III, who would ally? Probably Iran, Turkey, Russia, China, perhaps India or Pakistan, 1 versus 1. You know, which one would go on which side? Maybe India would side with like the allies in this circumstance. The axis would probably be more like the China, like the Eurasian steppe, that whole landmass. So I feel like that is very possible to happen, which was my fear also with Syria, was that you were already seeing these lines being drawn.
If you did have like a big global Cold War, I feel like India, Russia, Israel, US, and Saudi Arabia would be on the same side. And
I don't think so. Not necessarily.
You don't?
No, not necessarily. Maybe India with Russia, but I don't think that's necessarily what would happen.
I think India is a very strong ally of ours.
Yeah, but what about Pakistan?
Pakistan would not. Pakistan would not. No, Pakistan would not.
Nukes at each other not too long ago.
I know. No, Pakistan would not be on our side in that conflict. It would be India with us.
One anecdotal thing about Russia, by the way, is we have some distant relatives who are still living there who recently bought a place in the area that they took over from Ukraine. What do you call it?
Crimea?
Yeah, Crimea, yeah. So they got a home there in Crimea. Shit sucks. There's nowhere to go to the bathroom. It's like a third world hellhole where they're particularly at right now. But here's the thing, from the mentality of those people we know, they don't give a shit that bad things are happening in Russia, that there's economic problems. They like the fact that other people got screwed over, because that's the mentality where it doesn't matter that bad things are happening to me. Let's go get some land. Let's just take over more places and turn them into shitholes, and we're going to be happy. And that is a mentality that I don't think necessarily needs to happen in Russia. Like, look, after the peasants were freed, there were peasants who got educated, who became, like Anton Chekhov. Like, he is of a peasant stock. Like, transformation can happen within people in a short amount of generations. Look at the two Koreas, like they're almost like different. They're different size and whatever. Like, they're different people in a way. So what I'm getting at here is, when it comes to the mentality of the Russian people today, I don't think that that's necessarily a given, that that's always going to remain the case, or that would have been the case if somebody like Putin didn't take over. Like, I think that there's a lot of room there for Russians to become like Americans if things could have gone a slightly different way.
Well, that's the issue, right? Is that when the Soviet Union was falling apart, the purchasing of assets was basically managed by Americans. So what you actually see in Putin is a reaction against that sort of neoliberalization, which was happening at the same time in America and in the UK and various other places. So I don't know. Like, there's a reason why. Like, Putin's pretty popular in the country. But
the question is, what could have happened afterwards if Putin didn't go into power? Could Russia have had a lot more investments inside of it, and the economy would have picked up, and there would have been like for example, when Medvedev, I can't pronounce it, when Medvedev was president, there was a chance that Russia could have turned. Obviously, it didn't, but there was a chance as far as there being more human rights. And I know we talked a lot about human rights before, but I value human rights. Like, there could have been way more freedom happening in Russia that I personally think, with my limited experience, I personally think it would have allowed for there to be much more of investment in the capital and a much better economy in Russia. But now the situation is, like, with somebody like Putin, people view him, and this is, again, firsthand sources from the people that I personally know in Russia, people do view him as a big daddy. People view him as a godlike father figure. And that's always been like that Grozny, Chishaishi mentality that the Russians show to their czar. They do see him like that in a way. And I don't particularly think that's good, because when Russia is doing bad economically, people start complaining, food's running out. What happens? Russia tries to take a place over, takes it over. Then the Russian people are like, yay, we took over. This land is ours. And they completely forget about their economic problems. And I think that's a stripy hole, and I don't think it's going to end really well.
Well, that's like the question, right? This has been a question in Russian history for hundreds of years, is whether or not they should Europeanize, or whether or not they have their own sort of destiny, whether or not they should adopt European forms of government, or whether or not they should maintain their traditional forms of government.
They could have. They could have back in the first revolution that happened in 1917. Not the October one, but the I don't remember the exact date. But anyway, that was the revolution that could have ended up in a very different scenario. Russia could.
Oh yeah,
England.
there was the provisional government, but it
Yeah.
wasn't very strong. And I mean, the other thing is that there wasn't much mass support in it. There's a very big.
And there was
difference
World War
between-
One. There was World War One, and that sucked too because the Bolsheviks were the ones who were promising to get out of World War One. So yeah, unfortunately,
Well, you could go back to the Decembrists. Even you could go back pretty far.
Sure.
You could go back to Peter the Great, which is the main one, right? When Peter the Great brought in, was trying to Europeanize the old. The entire country, It's
well,
one
they were selling
Yeah.
fur coats back then. They weren't really doing that much economically, and you could say, sure, let's leave them be. But eventually, that vacuum's going to have some power taking it over, just like the Mongols took Russia over even earlier on. So that's why I think there's always going to be a negative force that's going to try to conquer people. The best that we can do is spread positivity, and hopefully, people will pick it up.
Positivity and strength. Fuck, I wanted to say something.
This is a good.
Yeah, my main thing is just that I try not to judge or to look down upon other forms of government that aren't based in European or particularly Anglo-American styles of government. They have different traditions, and I don't particularly care if they adopt ours or not. I'm not invested in it.
Right. There's a book that I really want to recommend for you. I think you would really get a lot out of it. Gavin Newsom's book, Citizenville. It's very short. You could probably get it used or something, or just download find an EPUB or something. But I would love to know what you think about that book.
Citizenville?
Citizenville. By Gavin Newsom.
All right.
I would love to know what you think of that.
And are there any books that you would recommend for us? Like we've already discussed the classic novels, but as far as certain books that have inspired your worldview, let's say.
I don't know. There's a lot, man. That's tough. I try to read very widely and through time and space, I guess. So, I don't know. Maybe read Spengler.
He's on the list. He's on the list.
It's a good one. It's very informative. That's basically the reason why I generally end up being tarred as a reactionary, on the super far right or whatever by a lot of people, is because those are the only people who talk about Spengler anymore, even though he's very, very influential in the 20th century.
Let's check him out.
Yeah.
I'll
Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan, absolutely. Gutenberg Galaxy by Marshall McLuhan is a very, very important book to me. Yeah, I'll say, let me start with those two. I got
Awesome.
to go on.
Cool.
Read the Bible. The Bible is very important.
Well, I have the Tanakh that I'm going to be reading, and then I'm going to read the New Testament. There was another book that I had here on the Bible designed to be read as living literature, the Old and the New Testaments in the King James Version. One, or do you recommend a different version of the Bible?
I go with the KJV. I mean, it's not the people debate whether it's the most theologically accurate, but it's the most influential when it comes to poetics. A lot of the phrases you use in daily life come out of the KJV. It's very important into English language culture in general. So yeah, read the KJV.
Mm-hmm. Will do. And do you also read any of the Gnostic texts?
I've read
for example,
pretty much all of them. Honestly, the only one that I find particularly fascinating, I think, is the Gospel of Thomas. A lot of them are read sort of pedantic, sci-fi. The lists of archons and shit. That's a little boring.
What do you think of the Book of Enoch?
Definitely interesting. It's
very psychedelic.
Very psychedelic.
Mm-hmm. I actually wanted to show you quickly over here. I don't know if this is going to be included in the recording or not, but I want to show you the list of books that I have right over here. And Spengler is actually in this list as well. Let's see. How do you do the
screen swap?
Here we go, screen share. Okay, so this is what I'm currently up to right now. So here's your book. I can
Nice.
probably put it over here in this column. So these are the next ones that we have. Wealth of Nations. I read Basic Economics before, but I want to read it again. We have Rules for Radicals. This is a book by a dude that we also had on our show, Milton Friedman, Aristotle, Sapiens, which Jules read. We have Solar History, The Failure of Globalism, Lessons of History, the Zohar. Have you ever read any of the Kabbalah stuff?
I've read more of Gershom Scholem's like history on it, not particularly like the primary sources though.
Well, it's going to be a lot of fun. And here we have The Power Broker about Robert Moses.
Yep.
Tragedy and Hope. This is a really long ass read, but I think it's going to help explain a lot of things. And as far as
some good stuff, yeah.
Thank you.
Looks like you got a good list here.
And here's the novels: Blind Owl,
Kafka.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, all solid. Bovary, solid.
Here we have
nice to put nice. Pale Fires, great. Yeah, it's a good list, man.
Thank you.
What I can say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look how huge this is. By the way, this is like these are all.
Oh, yeah, man. It never ends, man. Trust me.
No, this is.
We're gonna keep it going as long as we can here.
Mm-hmm.
It literally, the most depressing thing in the world is to think about how many books you'll be unable to read in your life.
No.
That's why we're for transhumanism as well. I want to live longer so that I could get all this stuff in my head. But anyway, Logo, I wanna thank you so much again for being with us, and let's do more of these. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, for sure, man. For sure.
This was
Let me
awesome.
know.
We'll
All
do
right.
more.
All right, yeah.
We're gonna bring everyone together. All right. Well, we're gonna do some cool things.
Sounds good, man. Sounds good. All right. Peace out, guys.